Good morning, I'm Brian Ross, and this is a special report from the Law and Crime Network. With the federal government now in the 18th day of a shutdown, and President Trump set to address the nation tonight about what he calls a crisis at the border, Americans rightly want to know what in the world is going on. Is it a crisis, or is it political opportunism, or somewhere in between? Joining me today to talk about all this are two officials who dedicated their careers to keeping this country safe. Mark Morgan, a former FBI agent who was the last chief of the U.S. Border Patrol under President Obama. And Richard Clark, a national security advisor to both Democratic and Republican presidents. And here in our studios in New York, Afia Yunus, an immigration attorney who works with clients working to come to this country legally. Let me start now with Mark Morgan. Mr. Morgan, you ran the Border Patrol under President Obama, and you were essentially fired by President Trump, asked to resign within a few days after the inauguration. You have not spoken publicly since that day, and now you are here at the Law and Crime Network. Breaking your silence, I want to start to ask you, what do you have to say? You stand on things that will surprise a lot of people.
Yes, Brian, and I have broke my silence for very specific reasons. So it is true that the current administration decided to go in a different direction after the president was inaugurated. And since then, I have remained silent. Initially, I thought to do so would really only serve certain political ideologies to use my talking points then to further serve their own agenda. And I didn't want to negatively impact the mission of the Border Patrol and the brave men and women who are risking their lives every day to protect this nation's borders. But as time went by, I saw the amount of rhetoric, the misinterpretation of facts, the manipulation of facts, and quite often just outright lies that have been told about all things related to border security. And so I finally, the last straw for me was when President Trump attended the national press conference along with the president of the Border Patrol Council, Brandon Judd. And they got up, and it resonated with me, Brian. You know, Brandon got up and he said something that was very succinct and very true. The wall works. And at that moment, I said, I can't remain silent anymore. Even though the president, the current administration is the one that removed me, I'm here today breaking my silence to tell American people that the president is correct in what he's doing. The wall works 100%. And I'm here today to support his efforts and what he's doing to get what he needs to improve border security for this great nation.
When you say the wall works, what do you really mean? A wall along the entire border?
So, and I think, Brian, that is a great question. And that's a question that I don't think is asked enough for people to find. So when the president or anybody else uses, quote, the wall, that's a great talking point to start the discussion. But the president, as well as everybody that has anything to do with national security along the border, knows what the wall means. What that represents, actually, when they say the wall, a physical barrier, a fence, whatever you want to call it. What that really represents is a multi-layered approach, one that involves infrastructure, technology, and personnel. That multi-layered strategy has been in effect since, a gatekeeper. Go on the website, look it up, inform yourself. That strategy worked then, and it works today. So when you say the wall, it's only one part of a multi-layered approach that works. The chief patrol agent of San Diego Border Patrol sector, he said it best. Because some people are talking about, well, why don't you just look at technology and other aspects? Why does it have to be a wall? Well, the analogy is it'd be like having a high-tech security system but not having any doors or windows in your house. The wall in itself is not the answer, but is a very critically important factor of that multi-layered approach.
Well, Mr. Morgan, let me play for you your testimony when you were still in office before the Senate committee looking into all this. You didn't call it a wall then, you called it a fence. Let's listen to this. We don't have that yet, but at that point you said a fence. Does it work? Yes. Is it needed everywhere? No. Is that correct? Is it needed everywhere?
No, it's not. And that's another, I think, manipulation and twisting of the facts. The current administration, nor anyone in the United States Border Patrol, whether the rank and file or leadership, has ever said that a wall is needed everywhere. It's never been said.
But that's what Mr.
once.
Trump has been saying, isn't it? A concrete wall is how he began his administration.
Right. And what he, again, I think some of that was a talking point to get the discussion started, because there are some areas where concrete walls, barriers are needed, levees, etc. So there are absolutely some areas which that's some concrete walls already in place, and those are needed or improved. The vast majority of the area is something, and again, if you talk to Border Patrol agents who they're the experts and do it every day, they'll actually tell you they want a type of physical barrier that they can see through so they can see what's going on the other side. I think part of the travesty here is we're getting lost in what is not really the relevant factor, whether you call it a wall, a fence, or a physical barrier. At the end of the day, it's all the same. We need something along the border, some type of physical barrier, I don't care what you call it, that works as part of that multi-layered approach I discussed.
In your testimony, you called it a fence. Let's listen to what you said then in November of 2016.
Do we need more fencing? Yes. Does it work? Yes. Do we need it everywhere? No. Is it the sole answer? No. It's part of an overall multi-layered strategy. And I was kind of tongue-in-cheek, the fence is great, but if we don't have access roads to get to the fence, it's not as good.
You both do.
So it's not needed everywhere for sure. You've talked
Correct.
about distortions and lies, but hasn't this administration been guilty of that itself in presenting facts to bolster its efforts to build a wall?
So that's not what I've seen. That's not what I've heard. Again, the president of the Border Patrol Council is someone who it's very open that didn't necessarily want me as the chief of the Border Patrol. I'm here today to tell you he's right. And I've listened to him. I've read what he's written. And if people actually read that, they've never said that we need this wall, fence, physical barrier everywhere along the border. That's never been said.
You don't think that's the message that the president has sent?
I think that if you look at something, you could always say, hey, it could have been messaged well. It could have better, I would say. But that's not what I've heard. I'm sure that
you heard the White House press secretary say there were 4,000 terrorists that tried to come across the southern border. You know that's not true, right?
Well, so here's the issue, and I'm glad you asked that too, and this is something that's very important to discuss, is it's the facts are getting manipulated. There's actually two sets of facts, right? There's the numbers that really are surround what's called known or suspected terrorists, the watch list. There's another set of numbers for special interest aliens. Those are two very distinct groups, and what I've seen happen really on both sides is those two groups and those two numbers are getting convoluted. Some people are calling terrorists when they're really talking about SIAs, and vice versa.
Well, it seems like there's been an effort. It seems there's been an effort to try to scare the American public. I want to bring in Richard Clark, who is probably the preeminent expert on the terror threat in this country. Mr. Clark, is a wall needed to stop terrorists from coming into this country?
Well, a wall will not stop terrorists from coming into this country. They don't come to the southern border and walk across. That's never been the case. The administration says there are 3,700 or something terrorists who walked across the border. That's not true. That number is, first of all, it's not terrorists. It's people on various lists of concern, and they're people who are picked up at airports around the world and denied access to flights to the United States. So there's an enormous amount of not just distortion in the data that the administration is using, they're outright lies. But, Brian, I would step back and ask a prior question. The president is going to say that this is a national emergency. Is it really? Now, why, of all of the issues that we could be talking about, why have we shut down the government over border control? Now, I know Mark thinks border control is important, and it is, but so are lots of other issues. We could be talking about the opioid crisis. We could be talking about the threat to Americans from guns in the hands of people who shouldn't have them. We could be talking about access to health care. We could be talking about improving STEM education. Why are we talking about border control? Why are we buying the premise the administration is thrusting in our face that there's a crisis on the border. There's no crisis on the border. What we do have is a problem where some people from Central America, notably from Guatemala and Honduras, are coming in larger numbers to our southern border and turning themselves in, not sneaking across the border, turning themselves in and asking for asylum. What's the problem? Well, we have failed states in Central America, and we could address that. We could have programs to improve security and development in those failed states and actually go after the root of the problem. Or we could have more asylum processing capability on the border, more asylum judges so that people could be adjudicated more quickly. But the truth of the matter is that 90% of the people who come to the border and ask for asylum are let go into our country and return to a judge for a hearing later on. 90% of them return for a hearing. And most of them are then denied asylum. The number of cases in the last few years where people have been granted asylum is about 20,000 a year. 20,000 a year, people granted asylum. What's the big deal? This is not a crisis. It's a problem, and it's certainly important to people like Mark who spent their lives working on it. But of all the things that we should be talking about as a country, of all the things that we should be saying is a crisis or a national emergency, this is not one of them.
So when the president says a crisis is here and Mark Morgan says the wall works, do you buy that at all, that the wall works?
Well, there's some places on the border now where we have a wall, and there are probably some additional places where we could have one, and other places where it would be a waste of money. The question is, should we spend $5 billion on this? Should we shut the government down and go through all the pain that people are suffering around the country because the government is shut down over this issue?
Mark Morgan,
why is it this issue, Brian? Ask yourself that. Why is it this issue and not opioids or guns or health care or anything else? And the reason is the president has identified correctly, beginning in his election campaign, that this is an issue that stirs up emotion and stirs up his base, the 35% of the American people that are devoted to him. He promised them that Mexico would pay for a wall, and now some of them, the right-wing talk show people, are holding him to account and saying, where is that wall? And so he is having to produce. But this is all about an emotional appeal to base instincts, fear of the immigrant, fear of the terrorist. He's whipping up fear, whipping up, I think, racism in order to consolidate his political base. There is no crisis on the southern border. There's a problem, and a wall is a minor part of the solution. You want to solve the existing problem? Add more asylum judges, add more reception facilities at the border crossings to deal with these asylum people. Go to Central America, along with Mexico and the UN and others, and deal with the failed states there so that these people won't need to come. That's how you solve the real problem, but it's not a crisis.
Mr. Clark, Mr. Morgan, when we come back, we'll talk about the human toll of all this. What's the price being paid by the people who are trying to come to this country? We'll continue with Richard Clark and Mark Morgan, and also joining us, Afia Yunus, when we return. We continue now with our special report on what President Trump is calling a crisis at the border. Joining me here now is Afia Yunus. Is there a crisis at the border?
No, and I think the narrative and agenda to dehumanize immigrants who are coming into the United States is unfortunately working. And I think what we need to do is pull back and see that these are human beings who are coming across the border to seek economic prosperity or to seek fear from persecution. These are mothers, fathers, children, brothers and sisters, and that has been lost in the narrative.
Are there, as Mr. Trump has said, drug dealers, rapists, murderers in this group?
I'm sure there's a negligible amount of people who are bringing drugs or violence into our country, but I ask, how is a wall going to prevent those people? What the wall will do is instead prevent people who are truly seeking freedom in the United States, freedom from persecution. These are asylum seekers. These are people who are seeking freedom from persecution, and they have a genuine visceral fear. And we as a country need to provide that safe haven to them.
Mr. Morgan, let me ask you, what do you make of what Afia has to say?
So, Brian, with all due respect to both Afia and Richard, this is part of why I'm here today, is they're twisting the facts of the narrative. So let's talk about...
They're twisting the facts, you think?
Well, let me explain. So let's talk about those individuals, the dreamers, or anyone else you want to put in that category. The wall, increased border security, is not intended, nor does it want to stop those individuals from coming. What we're saying, what is in the best interest of the national security of this country, is for those individuals that are looking for economic equality and trying to flee prosecution, is come to this country through the points of entry. Go through the process legally. Use the current asylum processes and policies legally. Do not try to enter this country for economic equality or prosperity illegally through the points of entry. Because let me tell you what happens. Those people are at the hands of the cartels. Those people are at the hands of the coyotes who don't give a darn about them, who take them on a perilous, treacherous track, who by the time they get to this country illegally in between the points of entry in the hands of Border Patrol, they're malnourished. They've gone without food, water. That is not the right way for these individuals who enter the country. No one, I have served this country for 30 years. The men and women of the United States Border Patrol who sacrifice their lives every day have never said that they do not want those individuals coming to the country. What they have said is, we have a process to do that legally. Please do it that way. And with all due respect to Richard, after 30 years of service in this country, I'm offended. I'm offended. And I reject the racist word. Because, Richard, you're calling me a racist because I support what President Trump is doing. I support the shutdown. I support his increased border security request, and I support the wall. So because of that, you're calling me a racist. And let me tell you, talk about how one could lead to this being a crisis. You talk about the opioid epidemic. Where do you think a lot of those narcotics are coming from? They're coming from south of the border. Yeah, absolutely. Now they're coming through the points of entry, but they're also coming in between the points of entry.
But you don't think, Mr. Morgan, you don't think a wall stops the illegal smuggling of drugs, which, as you say, comes through mostly ports of entry, hidden in trucks and vehicles, tunnels, trains?
Correct, Brian. You're absolutely right. But here's the issue: is it's still coming through in between the points of entry.
But a wall's not going to stop that. And let me ask Dick Clark, Richard Clark. You want to respond? Mr. Morgan takes objection to what you have to say.
Well, I think he used the word distortion. I think he's distorting, and I'm sure it's not intentional. What I said was the president is a racist. The president is trying to whip up portions of his base that fear the foreigner, that fear the immigrant. If you step back and ask yourself, what are the crises that we should be dealing with in this country? This one just doesn't rise to the top 10. Opioids are a crisis. Most of the opioid drugs in the United States that people are getting addicted to and people are dying from are prescription drugs that are abused, handed out at drugstores. That's the source of the major amount of the opioid crisis. And my understanding, and I used to be the guy in the White House National Security Council in charge of illegal narcotics programs, my understanding is that 90% of the drugs entering the United States from outside the United States come through our ports. And a very, very small percentage comes through in these areas between the borders. And in terms of the number of people seeking asylum, that's the change. There's been a change. We recognize that. There's been a change in the last 3 years. There are many more people coming from Central America seeking asylum. the vast number of them come to the ports of entry or turn themselves in voluntarily to Border Patrol officers when they cross the border.
Let me ask Afia Yunus about that. Those are your clients who come here are they trying to sneak across the border? Are they trying to cut in the line ahead of everybody else?
And I think if the problem, as Mark says, is that we're trying to get these people to funnel through ports of entry, then why is it that we have over 5,000 people still waiting at the ports of entry to come through to seek asylum? They're in danger as they're waiting at our ports of entry to come through. And we're doing 20 to 25 credible fear interviews a day for these individuals who are trying to come through. I have non-detained clients seeking asylum who have to wait years for an asylum hearing. Why is that? If that's the problem, let's do what Mr. Clark said. Let's get more judges, asylum judges, who can handle these cases. Why are they waiting years for asylum hearings? And why is it that we're waiting days, if not weeks and months at the border to actually get a credible fear interview? This is the problem.
So, Mark Morgan, how do you respond to that? Is that the real issue then?
No, what I would say,
the wall's not going to solve that, right?
Well, but here's the problem. I'll go back to what Chief Patrol Agent Rodney Scott said. You can have a high-tech security system in your house, but it's no good if you don't have doors and windows. So I think what the false narrative here is that they want to say, hey, let's do all of this, but we really don't need doors and windows in your house. So what I would say is the wall is part of a comprehensive, multi-layered approach. If you listen to what the commissioner of CBP, Kevin McElhinney, just said, who's a man who is a true patriot, he just talked about everything that Richard and Avi is talking about. The president has talked about the need for more immigration law judges. They've talked about the need for HSS to expand their resources and bed space. They've talked about that we've got to get to Mexico, and Mexico's got to get some skin in the game to be proactive participant in this immigration process. The commissioner talked about reaching out to Central Americans to help them improve their economy to stop the flow. So all this stuff is being talked about. And the wall. It's not one or the other. It should be a comprehensive package, and they're talking about all of that stuff. And Richard, again, the stats on asylum, I'm sorry, but you've got it backwards. It's not 90% of the people who come through and they're let into the interior of the United States. It's not 90% that show up for the hearings. It's actually 90% that don't show up for their hearings. And those that do show up, which is the minimum amount, 90% of those are actually rejected. So it's again, the facts get twisted and convoluted that are very important here. But again, when people say the wall's not going to fix everything, well, if you take any element out of this multi-layered approach, a single element by itself, like the increase of immigration law judges, I could say you could triple those. That's not going to solve the problem by itself. You could say we could reach out to Mexico and get them to get more skin in the game. That by itself isn't going to solve the problem. The wall by itself isn't going to solve the problem. But all of those factors are needed to address the problem. And here's another issue, and I know we've got to move on, but here's another issue in between the points of entry. It's just as important what we know we're apprehending, but it's also important to know that we're not apprehending everything. We don't know everything that's coming across that border. I mean, that's not talked about either.
Yeah. So Mr. Morgan, you are an unlikely person to be supporting President Trump, given the fact that he essentially fired you on the first day he took office. Did the White House ask you to do this? Why are you speaking out like this?
Brian, thanks for asking that question. So the answer is no. Nobody in the White House has asked me to.
Anybody else outside ask you to do this?
No, not even the president of the Border Patrol Council. I'm doing this on my own for one reason. It's corny and sappy, but it's true. I'm a patriot, and I respectfully disagree with Richard that I think you can have an intelligent debate whether we want to put a term that this is a crisis. I think you can have intelligent debate, but I absolutely consider this a problem that is worth the effort and the government shutdown. What we haven't talked about is, as chief of the Border Patrol, every single day, every day, this isn't hyperbole, this isn't me making it up based on a political ideology, this is truth and fact. Every day as chief of Border Patrol, I was briefed on rapists, murderers, gang members, and other violent offenders that were coming through in between the points of entry every single day, apprehended by the brave men and women of the United States Border Patrol every single day. And those are the ones we were apprehended. Not to mention, so we don't know how many we're getting through or we don't. And so when you talk about a crisis, I wonder if you talk about and you talk to the wife and the kids of the police officer who was just shot and killed by an illegal immigrant that should have never been here, I wonder how she would define what President Trump is doing. That's a narrative we don't talk enough about.
And Mr. Morgan, you're stigmatizing the entire group of people based on a handful of cases, and studies have shown that the likelihood of an illegal immigrant, a so-called illegal immigrant, committing a crime is less likely than the average American, in fact, as you know that. Mr. Clark, what do you think is the result of all of this? Is there a resolution here? Is there a compromise?
Well, I think there are a number of things that everybody would agree to. I think people would agree to increasing the number of asylum judges. People would agree to expanding the ports of entry so that they can handle.
Is there a wall configuration that could be found in some sort of compromise?
Well, there probably is an agreement that could be made for some areas to have additional fencing, but not from sea to shining sea, not $5 billion, not in places where the professionals really don't want it. Mark himself says it's not needed everywhere.
Okay, Mr. Clark, I want to thank all of our guests today for being here. Afia Yunus, Richard Clark, and Mark Morgan, thank you for coming on Law and Crime today. The President speaks tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern, and Democrats are asking for equal time to respond. The debate is far from over. The facts and the threat are far from certain. Meanwhile, the federal government now remains in its 18th day of being shut down. I'm Brian Ross in New York. Thank you for watching. Good day.